I think I was about 6 years old when I started to notice something felt unusual about our family home. My parents told me we had moved here when I was a baby, so it's been the only place I really call home, but it never quite felt right. I would go to friends' houses after school or at weekends for birthday parties, and the atmosphere just felt so different in comparison to when I was home. There hung an air of what I would describe as oppressive malevolence in our home, but as a child, it felt like fear, and I remember trying to articulate this cloying, crushing, almost sinister presence to my parents all those years ago, but it was casually disregarded as an overstimulated child's imagination. As I grew older, I felt a greater sense of unease at home and found myself staying with friends, doing whatever I could to prolong my time away before I had to come back. The feeling of anxiety and paranoia would rise back to the surface the closer I got to home. You see, it felt like I was being watched, like there was something in the home monitoring my every action. This wasn't an, oh, my parents could walk in at any moment, teenage level of paranoia either. No, this was hair standing on end, goosebumps, fight or flight instincts kicking into overdrive, as if my body and mind were sounding the alarm to get out, to run, but after searching every room on several occasions, there was never anything out of place. I continued to raise my concerns to my parents, but it fell on deaf ears. They chalked it up to acting out as a typical teenager would. They had bigger issues, as I could see the cracks starting to form in their marriage, eventually becoming all-encompassing as arguments ruptured around the house and their relationship began to crumble. All the while, the pressing feeling of malevolence continued to hang in the air. As time went on, their relationship completely broke apart. My mom had become a recluse, quit her job, and spent most days locked away in the spare room, only emerging to get food, with barely an acknowledgement to me or my father's existence. My father had become bitter and distant, a hollow shell of his former self, except for the infrequent outbursts of emotion, swaying from anger to desperate pleading whenever he and my mother crossed paths in the kitchen. The strange thing is, during this time, the home felt almost normal. The dread and paranoia I'd felt before had almost disappeared, but had been replaced by the anguish that comes from being in the middle of a family that's falling apart. It didn't last long, though, as my mother stopped emerging from the spare bedroom entirely, and the silence in the house was frequently punctuated by the thunderous knocks of my father's fist on the spare bedroom door, followed by his pleas to my mother to come out and eat, then the sorrowful sobbing of a broken man heading back to his room. I hated it. I hated being in the middle of it all and seeing the people I loved, my parents, my world, crumbling around me. All the while, I wasn't even pinging on their radar. I felt invisible. In such a short space of time, my father had become completely dissident, barely registering my presence despite my protests. My mother hadn't been seen for days, and he had come knocking on her door. I tried knocking myself, pleading with her to come out and eat, but it was met with silence each time. After several attempts, after multiple days, my father screamed at me to just leave her alone. A week had passed, and it felt like time had come to a standstill in the house. My father stopped going to work, and like my mother, he started to confine himself to the bedroom. The air felt stagnant. The silence was suffocating. I spent a long time out of the house, seeking solace in my friends and their families, too ashamed to admit what was going on at home, diverting questions over lunch to other topics of conversation. I wasn't prepared for the 8th day. I woke up in the middle of the night and immediately felt it, the rising dread, the pervasive feeling of being watched. My throat tightened, my pulse began to quicken, as the fear grasped my mind in an iron vice. It felt like I was 6 again, unable to truly convey and comprehend the internal terror I was going through. My fight-or-flight instinct screamed at me. I tried to force the feelings back and put my pillow over my head, but my mind was racing, and the surging feeling that something sinister didn't want me to sleep was destroying any chances of me getting rest. I decided to get up and see if going outside would help clear my mind. It was only after I climbed out of bed and my eyes had adjusted to the darkness that I noticed the smell. There was a rancid, foul stench in the air, like rotting food left out in the sun to fester in the heat. I accidentally took a breath and the smell clung in my throat, causing me to cough and retch in disgust. I grabbed a nearby shirt and put it over my mouth and nose to act like a mask, but it was of minimal effect against the invasive stench. I went into the hallway to see if I could try to figure out the source of the foul odor and noticed the doors to both spare room and my parents' room were open. I yelled my parents' names into the darkness, but was met with silence. So I cautiously walked down the hallway to the spare room, first to see if my mother was still there, and simply was in a deep sleep. As I got closer to the room, my hair began to stand on end as the feeling of dread became more and more intense. I reached the doorway, peering into the darkness, and was hit with an even more intense odor. Rotten food. No. Rotten flesh. I reached for the light switch, fumbling in the darkness to find it, half choking on the smell which was seeping through my makeshift mask. I managed to find the switch, and the room was bathed in light, illuminating the true horror before me. My mother, was in the wall. Her body had become fused with the wall of the house, contorted and crumpled as if she were slowly being devoured. Her face and what remained of her limbs could be seen protruding, gaunt, pale, her cheeks sunken, her eyes hollow, as if the moisture had been drawn out of her face. Her face held an expression of pure anguish, misshapen, stretched into a ghastly visage, violently screaming without sound. Tears clouded my view as I fell back into the hallway, and a wave of nausea hit me. I couldn't comprehend the horror I just saw. That was my mom, who only a few days ago had been fine, but now... I righted myself, pushing back my unraveling thoughts, and tried to regain my composure. Whatever happened here was not natural, and the being or entity that caused it may still be present. A chill ran down my spine as the next thought slipped into my mind. Father. My dad. I turned around and walked further down the hallway to my parents' bedroom and was met with the same disgusting smell. My heart sank as I reached for the light switch. He was on the floor, but only half his body was visible, for anything below his waist was scattered in the walls. I looked up to the ceiling and saw viscera, rotten flesh, poking out of the cracks above. What was once a magnolia room was covered in dark red and brown stains with scraps of flesh and shards of bone poking out of the walls. His neck was craned at an inhuman angle, forcing his head to look towards the ceiling, and like my mother, he was holding an expression of pure contorted agony. My mind was on the brink of collapse. I turned to leave the room when I saw he had one outstretched arm, which appeared to be pointing to something on the wall. I looked over from the doorway, paralyzed with fear and unable to convince my body to move closer. But I managed to make out what looked like a message scratched into the floor under his bloody fingernails. Burn it all before it feeds. I didn't have to be told twice. Adrenaline surged through my body, shaking me free from the shackles of fear and driving me into action. I rushed back out to the hallway and headed downstairs to the kitchen. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt heavy and the feeling of being watched became even more pervasive. My heart was racing. I could swear I could see the walls rippling and undulating, but each time my eyes tried to focus on a particular point, all I could see was darkness. Felt like whatever this entity was, it was becoming aware of my plans, and as I reached the kitchen, my body started to slow down. I was feeling drained, emotionally and physically, my mind crumpling under the stress and all I had seen. My body fighting back the waves of nausea and the cycles of adrenaline surging and dumping, causing my muscles to cramp. Through my addled mind, it was starting to make sense. Whatever this thing was, it influenced and fed on emotions, breaking people down enough to feed on them physically, and I was running out of energy and time. I took advantage of another wave of adrenaline and ran to the kitchen drawer, frantically fumbling in the dark until my hands clasped the round box of matches. I struck several matches, setting fire to the curtains above the kitchen sink. The flames began to slowly crawl up the curtains and spread to the nearby cabinet on the wall. A blood-curdling shriek reverberated around the house as the flames started to engulf the walls and smoke pumped across the kitchen ceiling. The walls started to pulsate violently, and I could hear the foundation cracking and feel it rumbling beneath my feet. The shriek kicked my fight-or-flight response into full gear, and I ran out the kitchen into the main hall towards the door. The walls shook more violently the closer I got to that door, and the mix of smoke and rancid, rotten flesh caught in my throat, making me almost vomit. I managed to compose myself as I reached the front door. My hand was on the handle when I heard a voice from behind me. "Where are you going, my love? It's late. Your father needs you." My mind nearly faltered, but I pushed the door open and ran outside to hear a scream of anger erupt from the house. Whatever this being was, it wanted me to stay, to perish with it, but I ran down the street and didn't look back. My life as I knew it was over, and I had to start again somewhere new. After all, who would believe me if I told them what had happened that night? I still get nightmares about what happened several years later. I looked online at the local newspaper, and it was determined to be a horrible accident. A tragic house fire killed a family of 3 with no suspicion of foul play. The emergency services who attended the scene didn't recall all the bones and bodies, but they chalked it up to the remains being scattered and buried in the debris as the house collapsed in the fire. The reason I've wrote all this is to serve as a warning. If you ever visit somewhere and you don't feel right, like someone's watching you, and your brain and your body are screaming, telling you to run, listen before it's too late. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our Spooky Ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our Spooky Skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. My time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.